September 24, 2001, and a 41-year-old woman named Gina Wilson Green has just been found murdered in her home on Stanford Avenue near LSU. She had been and strangled to death by a monster who would terrorize the city for years. 8 months after Green's murder, another woman's body would be discovered in her townhouse on Charlotte Avenue. This time it was Charlotte Murray Pace, a 22-year-old LSU graduate student who also appeared to live just 3 doors from Green. Reports showed she had put up a hell of a fight against her attacker before tragically succumbing to her wounds. Over the next few months, it would become clear that something, or more accurately, someone sinister, was stalking the streets of Baton Rouge and devouring victims without mercy. Meanwhile, in Chicago, another predator had been hunting. On the night of April the 13th, 1996, 25-year-old worker Laura Ilaki would receive a phone call at home. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was someone she'd been seeing, someone she trusted enough to meet late at night. At 10 p.m, he would pick Laura up and they would drive to Wolf Lake, their usual spot. However, she had no idea that this would be the last conversation she would ever have, because the next morning her body was found floating in Wolf Lake. 3 months later, on July the 14th, another young woman's body was discovered in the Vermilion River, about 90 miles south of Chicago. And 3 weeks after that, the corpse of 22-year-old Lynn Huber was found back in Wolf Lake. 3 women in 3 months, all killed in cold blood, their bodies found dumped in waterways around the Chicago area. And the killers in both cities shared something disturbing. They didn't look like the monsters they truly were. They looked like the nice guy next door. In Baton Rouge, the killer had a simple playbook: charm, deceive, and attack. 3 black women between the ages of 35 and 45 would later tell police about encounters with this charming, smooth-talking stranger who knocked on their door and asked to use their phones.
A man sometimes calling himself Anthony charmed his way close to 3 black females between the ages of 35 and 45 in Breaux Bridge.
They say he tried to rape a Breaux Bridge woman last summer. She told police the handsome man was charming and asked to use her phone.
But for Diane Alexander, that charm was a death trap, because when the man realized her husband wasn't home, the mask came off.
Alexander was beaten, her skull cracked, and the suspect even tried to rape her.
She said, "We laid on the floor. He told me to take my panties off. He whispered in my ear, 'I've been watching you.'"
He beat her with the phone she'd offered him to use and tried to strangle her with the cord. Alexander was fighting for her life when her son walked through the door, likely the only thing that sent her attacker fleeing. But by the time investigators started connecting the dots, 3 more women were already dead. First, 44-year-old Pam Kinamore, who was kidnapped from her home just 3 days after Alexander was attacked. Kinamore's husband, who was out of town during the attack, would return home to find spots of blood on their bedroom rug with his wife missing.
But just 3 days later, July 12th, 2002, 44-year-old Pam Kinamore is reported missing.
Pam has been missing since yesterday evening. We think about 9:30. She's a business owner in Denham Springs, and we know she worked till about 9:30.
3 days later, a survey crew would find her body just south of the Whiskey Bay exit.
Tuesday morning, a woman's body was found. Scene investigators say the body fits Kinamore's description.
And after examination, they confirmed that she had been beaten and stabbed to death.
In the weeks after Pam Kinamore went missing, law enforcement had few leads. At the time, the murders of Gina Wilson Green and Charlotte Murray Pace were connected through DNA, but investigators didn't have much else.
In November that year, another Baton Rouge woman, 23-year-old Trenisha Dean Colomb, would be kidnapped from her Lafayette home. Her belongings were found in Grand Coteau, near the cemetery where her mother had been buried just 7 months earlier. A hunter would find her body in the woods near Scott, Louisiana, 3 days after she was reported missing, and according to the autopsy report, she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. By March 2003, the killer would strike again, kidnapping his next victim, Carrie Lynn Yoder, a 26-year-old LSU biological sciences graduate student, from her apartment before brutally finishing her off. Initially, authorities would try and play it safe, claiming that Yoder's disappearance had nothing to do with the other murder cases. However, when her body was found in Whiskey Bay, near where Pam Kinamore's body had been discovered, it was clear that it had everything to do with the serial killer, and just like Kinamore, Yoder had been beaten and strangled to death. Upon investigation, DNA evidence linked all cases to the same killer. The quiet, friendly man who knocked on the doors and begged his victims to use their phones was actually Derek Todd Lee, a 34-year-old from St. Francisville, who would eventually be connected to 7 murders across Louisiana. When investigators dug into his background, they discovered an extensive criminal history stretching all the way back to 1984, when he was first caught peeping into people's homes. Almost 2 decades later, he was arrested for an attempted first-degree murder for attempting to kill his girlfriend at a bar. After the incident, Lee would also try to run over a sheriff's deputy with his car in an attempt to escape the police. At the time, he only got a 2-year sentence, which from the look of things wasn't enough to teach him a lesson, because after getting out, Lee transformed into the monster that terrorized Baton Rouge for years, assaulting and killing innocent women. This time though, there would be no way out. In August 2004, he was convicted of second-degree murder for killing 21-year-old Geraldine DeSoto and sentenced to life in prison. 3 months later, he was convicted of first-degree murder for the murder of Pace, and this time sentenced to death. However, Lee would end up passing away on January the 21, 2016 from heart disease at a Baton Rouge hospital while still on death row.
Killer Derek Todd Lee died this morning at a hospital. He had been rushed to the hospital earlier this week for medical attention, but because of HIPAA laws, no details were given out about what was ailing him.
But while Baton Rouge's serial killer was an ex-con who had a known history of delinquency, the killer in Chicago was a man that everyone expected to follow the law. Andrew Urdiales graduated from high school back in 1982 and joined the Marines, serving with distinction at Camp Pendleton in California. After his discharge in 1991, he moved back to his parents' home in Chicago and worked as a security guard at a local mall, where he would enjoy great trust amongst customers in the family-friendly environment. But behind this respectable facade was someone who had been a cold-blooded murderer since he was a child. Andrew's first kill wasn't a person, it was a dog. He had beaten his family dog to death with a baseball bat when he was just 12 years old, telling his parents that the animal had been fatally injured in a fall. That 12-year-old boy would grow up to become a cold-blooded killer who would take the lives of 8 women across 2 states, leaving a trail of bodies from California to Chicago. He would commit his first human murder while stationed at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, where he stalked 23-year-old communication art student Robin Brandley and stabbed her 41 times, taking her life. 2 years after his first murder, he would shoot and kill 29-year-old Julie McGee with a .45 ACP caliber pistol before dumping her body in a ditch near Cathedral City, California. And 2 months later, Urdiales would find another target, 41-year-old Mary Ann Wells, whose body was later found by police in an abandoned warehouse. Over the next 8 years, Andrews would claim 5 more victims, perfecting his methods and growing bolder with each kill. One woman, however, would somehow survive his vicious attack and live to tell the story. On September the 27th, 1992, Jennifer Asbenson, a 19-year-old nurse, was running late for her night shift at a home for disabled children in California. She had missed her bus and was panicking about being fired when a man pulled up and offered her a ride.
Didn't figure out the bus schedule, and I had been late a couple times to work. And so when someone pulled up and asked if I needed a ride, I had just missed the bus. I was young. I didn't think about the consequences, and who would ever think that the first person you take a ride with is going to be somebody, a serial killer, you know?
He drove her to work and invited her to breakfast the next morning. However, Jennifer wasn't interested in his advances, so she gave him a fake phone number. When she finished her shift at 6 a.m., the man was waiting outside in his car offering her another ride. Since he didn't do anything threatening the night before, she accepted the ride. However, that decision would almost cost her her life.
Came back the next morning. He was nice again and wanted to go to breakfast.
Because as they drove, he confronted her about the fake phone number and exploded into a rage. He slammed her head into the dashboard repeatedly, tied her hands with twine, and drove her to a remote desert.
Then when I got in the car the second time, he was upset about a fake number I gave him. He just tied my hands up. I just went into complete shock. He brought me into the desert. I just couldn't imagine what was going to happen to me. It was the scariest thing.
While at the desert, he tried to assault her, but would end up hitting and shoving her into his trunk when she tried to fight him off. However, Jennifer would manage to break out of the trunk and escape.
He put me in the trunk of his car, and I prayed, and I just got a burst of energy, and I was able to rip that trunk apart and take the binds off my hands, rip the trunk apart, and break out and run.
But when Jennifer told her story to authorities, they didn't believe her and therefore did nothing to find the perpetrator. This inaction would unfortunately cost 4 more women their lives before he was arrested 5 years later in 1997. After his arrest, Urdiales would provide detailed confessions to all 8 murders across both California and Chicago. While in custody, he told investigators he had no rational motive. He was simply agitated when the women begged for their lives. Urdiales would be given a life sentence for the 3 women he murdered in Chicago, but getting convicted of 5 murders in California, he would get the death sentence.
We also have breaking news right now. Convicted serial killer Andrew Urdiales has just been sentenced to death in a Santa Ana courtroom. The former Marine murdered 5 women in Orange, in San Diego, and Riverside counties between the years 1986 and 1995.
But justice would never truly prevail, because just 1 month after receiving his death sentence, Urdiales was found hanging in his San Quentin cell. But Lee and Urdiales weren't by far the only serial killers operating in these cities. In Baton Rouge, between 1997 and 2006, Ronald Joseph Dominique murdered at least 23 men and boys, earning the nickname the Bayou Strangler. According to reports, he would lure victims in with offers of alcohol and drugs before assaulting and strangling them and dumping their bodies in remote areas. Sean Vincent Gillis was another Baton Rouge serial killer who operated in the same area as Lee, killing 8 women between 1994 and 2004, while keeping body parts as souvenirs and storing photos on his computer to relive the murders. And in Chicago, the picture was even more disturbing. Since 2001, at least 51 women between the ages of 18 and 58 have been murdered in strikingly similar fashion within the city limits.
Chicago. Since 1999, dozens of women have been strangled, their bodies dumped, their murders unsolved.
Strangulation, asphyxiation, every single one of them done the same way.
The victims were mostly black, and many were workers, and nearly all of them had been strangled, partially or fully stripped, then dumped in abandoned buildings, alleys, and even garbage bins. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a troubling pattern, connecting every single case to just 3 police districts on the south and west sides, areas where violent crime was nothing new. In fact, in November 2007, 2 women were strangled and left in burning trash bins just 1 day apart, and by all indications, Chicago had a serial killer on the loose.
The Discovery Plus docuseries The Hunt for the Chicago Strangler takes a closer look at the murders of more than 50 women from 2001 to 2018 on Chicago's south and west sides, after the Murder Accountability Project identified a pattern suggesting a serial killer.
But when the activists and media pressure forced the Chicago Police Department to review the 51 cases, their report suggested there was no evidence of a serial killer at work.
And we asked the Chicago Police Department about these murders and this docuseries. The statement they gave us reads, each of these cases has been reviewed by detectives who were detailed to the FBI's Violent Crime Task Force, and there's no evidence linking the cases to each other or to suggest there's a serial killer responsible for these homicides.
But not everyone bought that, though. Those who believed the serial killer theory would point to the geographic clustering, similar victim profiles, and how rarely these murders resulted in arrests as classic indicators of a serial killer at work. However, critics argued the similarities could be explained by other factors, like the fact that strangulation is common in domestic violence and crimes against workers. The lack of matching DNA evidence also pointed to multiple perpetrators rather than one serial killer, as none of the 21 samples collected from the crime scenes matched. Whether the work of a single predator or many, dozens of women were murdered in nearly identical fashions over the next 2 decades, and their killer or killers remain free to this day. It's a grim reflection of one of the wealthiest cities in America, yet one that continues to suffer from some of the worst homicide clearance rates among major US cities, especially in impoverished black communities like those targeted by the alleged Chicago Strangler. And perhaps that's the one thing gang-related killings and other forms of violence in these cities truly share, a harsh reality where it's the poor who are most likely to die and least likely to receive justice. So in the end, which of these polar opposite cities is actually deadlier? On a quick glance, Chicago easily appears as the deadlier of the two, as the city records about 5 times more annual homicides compared to Baton Rouge, and in 2024 alone, Chicago recorded a whopping 573 homicides, which completely dwarfs Baton Rouge's 113. However, that alone has of course nothing to do with the deadliness of a city, which boils down to per capita numbers. With a population of nearly 3 million, residents of Chicago face a 1 in 167 chance of being a victim of a violent crime, whereas in Baton Rouge, that number is just 1 in 99 against a population of only 215,000. This means a person is 70% more likely to become a victim of a violent crime in Baton Rouge than Chicago. Moreover, even though Baton Rouge has seen a decrease in homicide rates over recent years, as mentioned in the beginning, this decrease has been way more modest than in many of the other cities, including Chicago, and Baton Rouge still has a homicide rate of 51.8 per 100,000 residents, among the highest in the country. That is to say, for every 100,000 people living in Baton Rouge, nearly 52 will be murdered in a given year, nearly 3 times Chicago's rate of 21.5 per 100,000. But of course, this isn't to say that Chicago isn't dangerous. Over the past 2 decades, the city's gangs alone have been responsible for 4,098 homicides. Chicago also led the nation in mass shootings, with 34 incidents in 2023 and averages over 2 gun violence victims on a regular day. However, the key fact is that these shootings and homicides concentrate heavily in specific neighborhoods like the South Side and West Side, where poverty rates are the highest compared to other parts of Chicago. So basically, in Chicago, as long as you stay out of certain neighborhoods, you're relatively safe. But unfortunately for residents of Baton Rouge, the city doesn't quite offer that same luxury, as violence in the city is scattered across the entire community and far more unpredictable, making everyone a potential victim, regardless of where they live or what they do.